It is 14 feet long and 3.5 feet wide. A single piece of linen, woven in the specific pattern called a 3-to-1 herringbone twill, a weave that interlaces the threads in a way that produces a subtle diagonal texture across the surface of the cloth. It is the color of aged ivory, faintly yellowed in the way that old linen yellows, and it bears on both its front and its back surfaces a faint, brownish, extraordinarily detailed image of a man. The image is not painted, it is not drawn, it is not the product of any medium or technique that science has conclusively identified in the 150 years since the cloth was first subjected to scientific analysis. The image is simply there, in the cloth, at a depth of a few thousandths of a millimeter, formed by what appears to be a chemical change in the fibers of the surface threads, a change that has no accepted explanation. The man in the image is approximately 5 feet 11 inches tall. He is bearded, with long hair that falls to the shoulders. He is naked. His hands are folded across his groin. His face is clearly, distinctly rendered. The nose, the cheekbones, the closed eyes, the beard. But across the surface of the body, in the image, there are marks on the wrists and the feet, a wound in the side. Dozens of small puncture wounds across the scalp, and distributed across the torso and the legs, in a regular pattern, the imprint of what appear to be lash marks, the specific linear wounds that a Roman scourging instrument, a flagrum with metal balls or bone tips attached to leather thongs, would produce on a human body. This is the Shroud of Turin. It is kept in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy, in a climate-controlled case, and it is the most scientifically studied object in human history. More scientific papers have been published about this single piece of cloth than about any other artifact. More analytical techniques have been applied to it, more specialists from more disciplines have examined it, more arguments have been made in more learned journals about its nature and its origin than about any comparable object anywhere in the world. And after all of that study, after all of those papers and all of those instruments and all of those arguments, science has not resolved the question. The Shroud of Turin remains what it has always been, a piece of cloth that presents evidence that pulls in more than one direction, that is consistent with contradictory conclusions, that defies the kind of single, definitive, universally accepted explanation that science is supposed to produce. This is not a video that will tell you what to believe. It is a video about what the evidence shows, and what it does not show, and what it cannot show. The viewer who arrives expecting resolution will not find it. The viewer who arrives expecting to have their existing beliefs confirmed will find that the evidence is more complicated than the simplest version of either the authentic or the forgery argument allows. The honest relationship to the Shroud of Turin is one of intellectual discomfort, the specific discomfort of something that does not fit neatly into any available category. It begins with a photographer. In the spring of 1898, an Italian lawyer and amateur photographer named Secondo Pia was given permission to photograph the Shroud of Turin during a public exhibition. The exhibition was the first in 20 years, and Pia was given the extraordinary and unprecedented privilege of photographing the cloth under proper photographic conditions, with lamps providing suitable illumination and the time necessary to make the exposures carefully. He photographed the shroud on May 28, 1898. That evening, in his dark room, Pia developed the glass negative plates he had exposed during the session, and in the red light of the dark room, as the image slowly emerged from the developing solution, he saw something that he later described as causing him almost to drop the plate in shock. The negative image on his photographic plate, which should have shown a reversed, tonally inverted version of whatever the original showed, was showing something remarkable. Rather than a reversal that made the image stranger and harder to read, the photographic negative was showing the image more clearly, more naturally, more three-dimensionally, more like a photograph of a human face, than the shroud itself appeared to the naked eye. The implication was immediate, and it was one that Pia understood the moment he saw it. For a photographic negative to show a clearer, more natural image than the original must itself be a negative. The image on the shroud was tonally inverted relative to what one would see if one were looking at a human face. The darker areas of the image correspond to the lighter areas of the face, and the lighter areas of the image correspond to the shadows. This is what a photographic negative does. It reverses the tones. But the shroud was created, if the dating is medieval, approximately 500 years before photography existed. A medieval forger who created a negative image would have had to know, precisely and accurately, what the image would look like when photographically reversed. They would have had to paint or create a tonally inverted image of a human face, an image that looks strange and somewhat wrong to the naked eye, but that, when reversed, produces a natural and compelling portrait. And they would have had to do this without the ability to photograph the result and check it, without any reference for what a photographic negative would look like, without any technology that would allow them to verify that the inverted image they were creating would produce the result they intended. No medieval painting or artwork operates in this way. Flat art creates images that look like what they represent. Negative images, tonally inverted, require either a knowledge of photographic chemistry that did not exist until the 19th century, or some other method of image formation that is not a direct artistic process, but a contact or projection process of some kind. The negative character of the shroud image was the first anomaly, discovered in 1898, and it has not been satisfactorily explained by any theory of medieval artistic fraud in the 125 years since. The history of the cloth before 1898, and indeed before the second half of the 14th century, is a matter of considerable debate and some dispute. The documented historical record of the shroud begins in France in the 1350s, when a cloth bearing what was described as the imprint of the figure of Christ was displayed in a wooden church in the small village of Lirey in the Champagne region. The cloth was in the possession of a French knight named Geoffroy de Charny, who had died at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, and whose widow and then daughter continued to exhibit the cloth at Lirey in subsequent years. The appearance of the cloth in Lirey provoked immediate controversy. The local bishop, Henri de Poitiers-Jouffroy, investigated the exhibition and had it suspended, and his successor, Pierre d'Arcis, wrote a memorandum to the Pope in 1389 that constitutes one of the primary documents in the historical case against the shroud's authenticity. D'Arcis claimed that his predecessor had discovered the cloth to be a forgery, that an artist had been found who confessed to having painted it. He called the image cunningly painted. He urged the Pope to suppress the exhibitions. The Pope, Clement VII, responded by allowing the exhibitions to continue, while requiring that they be accompanied by an announcement that the cloth was a representation rather than a relic. The D'Arcis memorandum is real, and its claims are specific. A named bishop, claiming a named predecessor's investigation, found a named type of fraud. But the document itself is the sum total of the evidence for the painting claim. The artist who allegedly confessed is not named. The investigation records of Bishop Henri de Poitiers are not preserved. No painting has been identified that corresponds to the shroud image or that demonstrates the technique by which such a forgery might have been made. The memorandum is one bishop's claim, made in the context of a dispute over ecclesiastical authority over a popular relic and the revenue its exhibitions generated, and its evidentiary weight is accordingly limited. In 1453, Marguerite de Charny, the granddaughter of Geoffroy, gave the shroud to the Duke of Savoy in exchange for property. The cloth then entered the possession of the House of Savoy, one of the most powerful dynasties of the period, and its subsequent history is well documented. It was kept in the Sainte-Chapelle at Chambéry, the Savoy capital, until December 4, 1532, when a fire broke out in the reliquary chapel. The silver reliquary in which the shroud was stored heated to the point where the silver melted, and molten silver dripped onto the folded cloth and burned through it, creating the pattern of burns and holes that is still visible on the cloth today. Water used to fight the fire left water stains. The shroud survived, folded in its case, and in 1534, nuns of the Order of Poor Clares repaired the burn holes with linen patches and added a backing cloth. The effects of the 1532 fire on the shroud are relevant to the scientific analysis of the cloth that would come centuries later, for reasons that will become clear. In 1578, the shroud was moved to Turin, where it has remained ever since. En aquellos tiempos, decían que en la niebla se escondían voces. No las llames, no respondas. Before Secondo Pia's photographs of 1898, the shroud had been a religious object, venerated by believers and questioned by skeptics, without any systematic scientific investigation of its properties. Pia's discovery of the negative image changed this permanently. From 1898 onward, the shroud was not merely a religious object, but a scientific puzzle, something that demanded explanation in terms that went beyond faith or tradition. The decades that followed saw increasing scientific interest and the first attempts at rigorous analysis. The most ambitious scientific examination of the shroud in the 20th century was conducted in October 1978 by a team of American scientists who called themselves the Shroud of Turin Research Project. 33 scientists spent 5 days in direct examination of the cloth, working through nights as well as days, applying instruments ranging from X-ray fluorescence spectrometers to ultraviolet and infrared photography to microchemical analysis. They brought roughly $80,000 worth of equipment in 27 crates and conducted what was, by any measure, the most comprehensive scientific examination of a single archaeological object that had been attempted up to that point. The STURP team published their findings in 1981. The summary conclusion of that report has been quoted in every subsequent discussion of the shroud. We can conclude for now that the shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. The bloodstains are composed of hemoglobin and also give a positive test for serum albumin. The image is an ongoing mystery, and until a satisfactory explanation for the existence of the image is developed, the problem will remain with us. The 2 decades between the STURP examination and the end of the 20th century produced a stream of published analyses, some supporting and some challenging the basic STURP conclusions. But the scientific event that dominated the shroud discussion in the late 20th century, and that continues to dominate it today, was not a STURP finding. It was the 1988 carbon dating. The radiocarbon dating of the shroud was, at the time, presented as the definitive scientific resolution of the authenticity question. Pope John Paul II approved the testing. Samples were taken from the cloth in April 1988 at Turin, in the presence of representatives of the Vatican, the Archbishop of Turin, and the 3 laboratories that would conduct the tests. The laboratories were the University of Oxford, the University of Arizona, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. The sample was cut from one corner of the shroud, in an area that had been handled and examined frequently over the centuries. The results, announced in October 1988, placed the linen with 95% confidence between 1260 and 1390 AD. The midpoint of the range, approximately 1325 AD, was strikingly consistent with the cloth's first documented appearance in Lirae in the 1350s. The three laboratories had produced concordant results. The test had been conducted under rigorous conditions, and the conclusion seemed clear. The shroud was medieval. The scientific and popular response was immediate. For many, the case was closed. The carbon dating was the most reliable scientific dating method available, and 3 independent laboratories had produced the same result. The cloth was a medieval object, and whatever debates might continue about how the image was formed, they were debates about medieval technique, not about ancient shrouds. But the debate did not close. It intensified. The challenge to the 1988 dating came from multiple directions, but the most rigorous and the most significant came from an unexpected source, a chemist who had initially been skeptical that the dating could be wrong. Ray Rogers was a physical chemist at Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico, one of the most distinguished scientific institutions in the United States. He had been a member of the STURP team in 1978 and had retained his own samples from that examination, small pieces of sticky tape that had been pressed against the cloth to collect fibers and particles from the surface. When the 1988 dating was announced, Rogers believed it was probably correct. He thought the challenges being raised were scientifically weak, and that the skeptics of the dating were motivated by prior commitment to authenticity rather than by scientific evidence. He began to examine those skeptical arguments, not to validate them but to refute them properly, and in the course of doing so, he found something that he had not expected to find. The argument that Rogers was examining was the claim that the sample used in the 1988 dating had been taken from a repaired section of the shroud, a section that had been rewoven with newer linen sometime in the medieval or early modern period to repair damage, and that the newer linen had produced a medieval date while the original cloth was much older. Rogers considered this claim implausible, but chose to test it rigorously, using his own samples from the tape collection. He examined fibers from the raised sample, a section of the cloth near the corner from which the 1988 dating samples had been taken, and he compared them to fibers from the main body of the shroud. What he found, he later said, was not what he had expected. The corner samples contained cotton fibers that were not present in the main body of the cloth. The corner samples contained a different chemical composition of the surface coating on the fibers. The corner samples and the main body samples showed dramatically different levels of a specific chemical compound, vanillin. Vanillin is a compound produced naturally by the degradation of lignin, the structural polymer found in plant cell walls, including the cell walls of the flax fibers from which linen is made. In fresh flax, vanillin is present at relatively high concentrations. Over time, as the lignin in the fibers slowly breaks down, the vanillin is released and dissipates. Very old linen contains little or no vanillin. The rate of this process depends on temperature and humidity, but under the conditions of storage typical for a cloth like the shroud, it is a useful indicator of age. The main body of the shroud, when tested by Rogers using his tape samples, contained no detectable vanillin. 0. The fibers from the main body of the cloth had lost all their vanillin, as would be expected in linen that was very old. The corner area, from which the 1988 dating samples had been taken, contained vanillin at levels consistent with much younger linen. Rogers also identified what he believed was evidence of reweaving. The cotton fibers found in the corner area, but not in the main body, suggested a material difference between the two sections. The chemical coating on the corner fibers was different from the coating on the main body fibers. These differences, he argued, were consistent with the corner area being a repair, a section of the cloth that had been rewoven at some point after the original linen was made, possibly using a technique that was specifically designed to match the original so closely that the repair would be invisible to casual examination. He published his findings in January 2005 in the peer-reviewed journal Thermochimica Acta. The paper was called Studies on the Radiocarbon Sample from the Shroud of Turin. Rogers used the vanillin kinetics, the known rate at which vanillin degrades under various temperature conditions, to calculate the age of the main body of the shroud from the absence of vanillin in those fibers. His conclusion was that the main cloth was between 1,300 and 3,000 years old, a range consistent with first-century origin. Ray Rogers died in March 2005, 2 months after his paper was published. The Rogers findings have been both supported and contested in the scientific literature since 2005. Supporters have replicated aspects of his chemical analysis and have found additional evidence consistent with the repair patch hypothesis. Critics have questioned his methodology, his interpretation of the vanillin data, and the significance of the cotton fibers, arguing that the differences between the corner samples and the main body are within the range of normal variation rather than evidence of a fundamentally different piece of cloth. The specific claim that a medieval repair of the invisibly rewoven type Rogers describes was performed on the shroud has not been definitively confirmed or refuted. Researchers who have examined the cloth in the corner region have noted that the weave pattern in that area is subtly different from the main body, but the interpretation of this difference remains contested. The question of whether the 1988 dating sampled original linen or a later repair is, as of this writing, an open scientific question. This matters enormously for the evidentiary status of the carbon dating. If the samples tested in 1988 were from a 14th century repair rather than from the original cloth, the dates produced are dates of the repair, not dates of the cloth. The authentic cloth, under this scenario, was not tested. The test that was supposed to resolve the shroud question definitively did not test the thing it was supposed to test. This is not a fringe argument or a faith-motivated dismissal of science. It is a testable scientific claim that has been published in a peer-reviewed journal by a distinguished chemist who was initially skeptical of it. Its resolution requires further testing, specifically testing of samples from the main body of the cloth rather than from the corner area, and the Vatican has not yet approved such additional testing. The question of the image itself is where the scientific anomalies of the shroud are most concentrated and most difficult to explain within a medieval forgery framework. In 1976, 2 physicists from the United States Air Force Academy, John Jackson and Eric Jumper, were members of a group examining the shroud photographs. They had access to a device called the VP-8 Image Analyzer, an instrument developed for NASA for the analysis of satellite photographs. The VP-8 converts the brightness values in a photograph into vertical relief. Brighter areas are raised higher, darker areas are lower. The result is a 3-dimensional surface, derived from the 2-dimensional image. When photographs of ordinary artwork, paintings and drawings and prints, are processed through the VP-8, the results are distorted and meaningless. A painting represents an attempt to create the illusion of 3-dimensionality on a flat surface. But the brightness values in a painting encode information about light and shadow as the artist understood and rendered them, not information about actual geometric distance. The VP-8 interprets brightness as distance, and when it does this with a painting, the result is a twisted, incoherent mess that bears no geometrically meaningful relationship to any three-dimensional object. When Jackson and Jumper processed the Shroud image through the VP8, they saw something different. The brightness values in the Shroud image, when interpreted by the VP8 as distance information, produced a coherent, geometrically accurate, three-dimensional relief of a human figure. The facial features rose and fell in the correct proportions. The body contours were anatomically consistent. The image contained three-dimensional information encoded in its brightness values. Information that is not present in painted images, because painted images are created by artists who encode artistic interpretation rather than geometric measurement. This is not a property that is difficult to define or to test. Take any painting, any medieval fresco, any portrait photograph, and run it through the VP8. The result will be distorted. Take the Shroud image, process it through the VP8 or through the modern digital equivalents of that analysis, and the result is a three-dimensional relief that is geometrically accurate. This property has been confirmed by multiple independent researchers using multiple different image processing approaches. It is not in dispute. What is in dispute is what it means. The presence of 3D information in the image indicates that the brightness variations in the image encode actual distance information, that the brightest areas of the image are the areas that were closest to whatever caused the image to form, and the darker areas are the areas that were further away. This is consistent with a contact process, an image-forming event in which the cause and the effect were separated by varying distances across the surface of the cloth. It is consistent with a cloth that was draped over a three-dimensional body, with the parts of the cloth closest to the body receiving the strongest image-forming effect, and the parts of the cloth further away receiving a weaker one. It is not consistent with a painting. A painter who was trying to create a negative image that would encode three-dimensional information at the correct geometric distances would need to have not only the knowledge of photographic negativity that has already been noted as anachronistic, but also a measurement of the actual geometric distances from every point of the cloth to every corresponding point of the body it was draped over. This would require not artistic skill, but photogrammetric measurement, a level of geometric precision that is not associated with medieval art and whose application to the creation of a fraudulent relic would be, to put it gently, an unusual choice. The Sturp examination of 1978 found additional anomalies in the image at the microscopic level. The image is formed exclusively on the surface fibers of the linen. Each thread of the shroud weave is composed of numerous individual fibers, microscopic strands of flax that are twisted together to form the threads. The image coloring affects only the very outermost fibers of the outermost threads, the topmost layer of the cloth's surface. The fibers immediately below the surface fibers, even within the same thread, are uncolored. The penetration of the image into the cloth is less than 200 nanometers, less than 0.2 of a micrometer. This is extraordinarily shallow. No paint or pigment applied to the surface of a cloth would penetrate to a depth this shallow and no less. Pigments in solution would be drawn into the cloth by capillary action. Pigments in a binder would coat the fiber rather than selectively coloring only its very surface layer. The image chemistry observed in the Sturp examination and confirmed in subsequent work is not the chemistry of applied pigment. It is the chemistry of oxidized and dehydrated cellulose, the same chemical change that makes linen yellow with age, concentrated in an extraordinarily thin layer at the very surface of the fibers. The formation of a chemically specific, tonally coherent, three-dimensionally accurate image by the surface oxidation and dehydration of the very outermost fibers of a linen cloth, without any penetration of the image-forming agent into the cloth, and without any identifiable residue of a medium that could have caused the effect has not been replicated by any known technique, medieval or modern. Researchers have attempted to reproduce the shroud image using various methods: laser pulses, ultraviolet radiation, electrical discharge, chemical vapors, contact processes with heated bas-reliefs, and various other approaches. None of these has produced an image that replicates all of the known properties of the shroud image simultaneously: the shallow penetration, the negative character, the 3D information, the absence of applied medium, and the specific chemical nature of the coloring. This is not a claim that the image is miraculous. It is a claim that the image is scientifically anomalous, that it has properties that no known physical or chemical process is known to produce, and that the most basic demand of science, that an observation be explained by a known mechanism, has not been met for the shroud image after more than a century of trying. The blood on the shroud adds another layer of evidence that the STURP team and subsequent researchers have examined. Blood in the image regions and in the areas corresponding to the wounds described by the STURP team has been analyzed chemically and found to be consistent with real human blood. The blood stains give positive results for hemoglobin, for albumin, and for bilirubin. Bilirubin is the compound that is particularly informative. It is produced when red blood cells are broken down, a process that occurs continually in the normal functioning of the body and at a much accelerated rate when the body undergoes extreme physical trauma, such as severe beating and crucifixion. Bilirubin is removed from the bloodstream by the liver in a healthy person, but in a person who has undergone severe trauma, the bilirubin produced by the breakdown of damaged red blood cells can accumulate in the blood at levels much higher than normal. The bilirubin levels in the bloodstains on the shroud are, according to the analyses that have been performed, consistent with blood from someone who died following extreme traumatic stress. This kind of blood, with elevated bilirubin, would appear more yellow-orange than normal blood when dried, which is consistent with the appearance of the shroud bloodstains. The blood flow patterns on the shroud have been studied by forensic scientists, and the studies have consistently found that the patterns are consistent with crucifixion. The wound in the left wrist, visible as a blood stain in the shroud image, shows blood flow at an angle that is consistent with blood flowing from a raised arm. Experiments with crucified bodies, conducted by forensic pathologists, have confirmed that blood from a wound in the wrist of a crucified body flows at an angle of approximately 55 to 60 degrees from the vertical, consistent with the position of a crucified man's arms. The blood flow patterns on the shroud are consistent with this angle. The wound in the wrist, rather than the palm, is itself forensically significant. Medieval depictions of the crucifixion almost universally show the nails through the palms, consistent with the traditional artistic representation. Anatomical studies conducted in the 20th century have demonstrated that nails through the palms would not support the weight of a human body. The nails would tear through the relatively delicate metacarpal bones and soft tissue of the palm. Nails through the wrist, between the carpal bones, would support the body weight without tearing through the tissue. The forensic conclusion is that Roman crucifixion was probably performed with nails through the wrists, not the palms. But a medieval forger, creating an image consistent with medieval artistic tradition, would have shown nails through the palms, not the wrists. The shroud shows the wound in the wrist. The scourge marks on the shroud have also been studied in forensic detail. They are distributed across the back, the sides, and the legs in a pattern consistent with flagellation by two individuals using an instrument called a Roman flagrum, a short-handled whip with multiple leather thongs, each tipped with metal balls or bone. The marks left by such an instrument have a characteristic dumbbell shape, two small circular marks connected by a line, produced by the two metal balls at the end of each thong striking the skin. The marks on the shroud correspond in shape size, and distribution to what a Roman flagrum would produce, and the pattern of distribution is consistent with flagellation by two people standing at different positions relative to the body. The marks on the scalp of the image are consistent with wounds produced by a crown of thorns, not a circlet or a wreath, as medieval European art typically depicted, but a cap-like distribution of puncture wounds across the entire scalp. This is the wound pattern that would be produced by a thorny cap, not a circlet, and again, it is a medical forensic detail that differs from the medieval artistic tradition. Pollen evidence that has been gathered from the shroud adds a different kind of argument, one that is geographic rather than chemical or physical. In 1973, and again in 1978, Max Freisulzer, the head of the scientific division of the Zurich police and a trained botanist, was given permission to press sticky tape samples against the surface of the shroud and collect the microscopic particles adhering to the cloth. In 1978, the Sturp team also collected tape samples. Freisulzer identified, over the course of his analysis, 58 species of pollen from the shroud samples. The pollen grains he found came from plants growing in 3 distinct geographic regions: Europe, specifically France and Italy, consistent with the shroud's documented history in those countries; the region of the Anatolian Plateau, in what is now Turkey, where Constantinople and later Istanbul are located, and the region of Israel and Palestine, specifically including plants that grow only in the specific climatic zone around Jerusalem. The plant species identified from the Jerusalem region include Gundelia tournefortii, a plant related to the artichoke family that is native to a relatively restricted geographic area of the Middle East, and that flowers in spring. The presence of pollen from this plant on the shroud, in quantities larger than would be expected from casual contamination, suggests that the cloth was in the Jerusalem area during the spring flowering season of that plant. The pollen from Anatolian plateau plants suggests the cloth was in the Constantinople area. The European pollen is consistent with the documented history. This pollen distribution, if accurate, is consistent with a cloth that traveled from Jerusalem to Constantinople to France. The route that several researchers have proposed for the shroud before its first documented appearance in Lirey. The shroud has been tentatively identified by some researchers as the image of Edessa, a cloth bearing an image of Christ that was moved from Edessa to Constantinople in 944 AD and that subsequently disappeared from Constantinople during the sack of the city in the Fourth Crusade in 1204. Under this identification, the shroud would have been taken from Constantinople by the Crusaders and eventually come into the possession of the Charny family, perhaps through the Knights Templar or through direct purchase from a Byzantine source. This identification is speculative and not established, but the pollen evidence is at least consistent with it. The cautions about the pollen evidence are significant. Freisulzer's methodology has been questioned after his death, partly because his identifications were not always accompanied by the photomicrographic documentation that modern palynological standards would require. The identification of pollen grains from photographs rather than from direct microscopic examination introduces the possibility of error. Subsequent analysis of some of the same tape samples by other researchers has confirmed some of his identifications while being unable to confirm others. The pollen evidence is suggestive, and in its most striking elements, it is consistent with the authentication hypothesis, but it falls short of the standard of independent replication that would make it conclusive. The herringbone twill weave of the shroud has been cited as evidence consistent with 1st century Near Eastern textile production. The specific 3-to-1 herringbone twill is a weave pattern that has been found in archaeological textiles from the 1st century AD, including textiles found at Masada, the Jewish fortress that was destroyed by the Romans in 73 AD. The presence of this weave pattern in 1st century textiles is consistent with the shrouds having been woven in that period. The counter-argument is that the herringbone twill is not exclusively a 1st century pattern. It appears in medieval European textiles as well, and its presence in the shroud cannot establish a 1st century date independently of other evidence. The weave is necessary, but not sufficient evidence for a 1st century origin, and it contributes to a circumstantial case rather than providing definitive dating. The 1532 fire and its relationship to the scientific examination of the shroud is a complicating factor that any honest analysis must acknowledge. The fire heated the cloth, and heat is one of the factors that affects the vanillin degradation rate that Rogers used to estimate the age of the main cloth. If the fire raised the temperature of the cloth significantly, it would have accelerated vanillin degradation and caused the cloth to appear older than it actually is by Rogers' kinetic dating method. Rogers' calculation accounted for this, using estimates of the temperature reached during the fire and the duration of exposure, but estimates are not measurements, and the temperature the shroud actually reached in 1532 is not precisely known. The fire also affected the chemical composition of the cloth in other ways, introducing products of combustion and affecting the fibers through direct heat and smoke damage. Any chemical analysis of the shroud's fibers must account for the possibility that the observed chemistry reflects the history of damage and repair, as well as the original character of the cloth. This is not an objection that is unique to the shroud. All ancient textiles carry the chemical signatures of their history, not just their original composition. The specific question of the 1988 carbon dating and the repair patch hypothesis remains unresolved and contested. Those who accept the 1988 dating as reliable point out that the 3 laboratories produced concordant results, that the methodology of accelerator mass spectrometry dating is well established and tested, and that the claim of a medieval repair of the specific character Rogers described requires a highly skilled invisible reweaving that would have been extremely difficult to execute. They argue that while the Rogers evidence is interesting, it is not sufficient to overturn 3 independent, concordant laboratory results. Those who question the 1988 dating point to Rogers' published chemical evidence, to the documented history of repair to the shroud, to the difference in weave characteristics observed in the corner area, and to the specific anomaly of dating results that are extremely consistent with the first documented appearance of the shroud in France, while being difficult to reconcile with the image's scientific properties. They argue that the concordance of the 3 laboratories is expected if all 3 sampled from the same repair patch, and that the methodological issue is not with the dating process, but with the sampling. The question of what a medieval forger would have had to know and be able to do is relevant throughout this analysis, and it is a question that does not have a simple answer. A medieval forger who created the shroud image would have needed to create a negative image without photographic technology, encode 3-dimensional information without photogrammetric measurement, form the image only on the surface fibers of the linen without penetrating the cloth, use blood with elevated bilirubin consistent with traumatic death, position the blood flow patterns consistent with actual crucifixion rather than medieval artistic convention, place the nail wound in the wrist rather than the palm, and either obtain pollen from Jerusalem and Anatolia or have the cloth travel through those regions before deploying it as a forgery. The cumulative improbability of a medieval forger doing all of these things, many of them beyond the knowledge of medieval science or art, is the strongest argument for the authentication position. The fact that the specific combination of properties observed in the shroud is inconsistent with any known method of image formation, medieval or modern, is what makes the image scientifically anomalous. The counter-argument is that our knowledge of medieval technique is incomplete. We do not know everything that medieval artisans and craftsmen were capable of. Techniques that seem impossibly advanced from the perspective of recorded history may have existed and been lost. A sufficiently skilled medieval craftsman, applying knowledge that was not written down and that has been lost to history, might have produced the shroud using methods we no longer know. The argument from the impossibility of medieval technique is limited by our knowledge of medieval technique, and our knowledge is not complete. The specifically scientific question of who was buried in the cloth, if someone was, is not addressed by any of the physical or chemical evidence. The shroud, if authentic, is a burial cloth, but a burial cloth is not an identity document. The wounds visible in the shroud image are consistent with Roman crucifixion, a method of execution widely used in the 1st century in the Roman Empire, applied to thousands of individuals before the practice was eventually abolished. The wounds consistent with scourging, with a crown of thorns, with crucifixion by nails through the wrists, are consistent with a specific kind of death that was not unique to any single individual. The identity of whoever is in the cloth, if anyone is, cannot be established by the physical evidence alone. This is the territory into which science cannot follow, and it is the territory where the conversation about the shroud most frequently loses its rigor and its honesty, on both sides of the argument. Those who want the shroud to be what tradition claims it is are sometimes too quick to move from the scientific anomalies to the theological conclusion, treating the evidence for a 1st century Jewish burial cloth as evidence for a specific identity that the evidence cannot establish. Those who want the shroud to be a medieval forgery are sometimes too quick to treat the 1988 dating as definitive when the Rogers evidence raises genuine questions about the validity of the sampling. The honest position on the Shroud of Turin, the position that the evidence supports, is a position of informed uncertainty. The cloth has properties that are genuinely anomalous. The image cannot be explained by any known technique. The blood chemistry is consistent with real blood from an individual who died in extreme trauma. The pollen distribution is consistent with a cloth that had been in Jerusalem and Constantinople. The vanillin evidence raises genuine questions about the validity of the 1988 dating samples. None of this proves that the shroud is a 1st century burial cloth of any particular individual, but none of it is explained by the hypothesis of medieval forgery without attributing to a medieval forger knowledge and capabilities that are not documented anywhere in the medieval record. The shroud is kept in Turin in a climate-controlled case. It is brought out for public exhibitions rarely, and each exhibition draws millions of pilgrims and visitors who stand before the cloth and experience whatever they experience in its presence. For the faithful, the cloth is a relic, potentially the most significant physical object connected to the most significant event in human history, and its presence in a glass case in an Italian cathedral is a form of proximity to something holy. For the scientist, the cloth is an anomalous artifact that presents properties inconsistent with any known production method and that has resisted definitive explanation for 150 years of study. For the historian, the cloth is a documented medieval object with an undocumented prior history, whose first appearance in France is explained by no reliable source, and whose subsequent veneration says as much about the religious culture that received it as about the object itself. These three relationships to the shroud are not mutually exclusive. The faithful scientist is not required to abandon rigor in order to venerate. the skeptical historian, is not required to pretend that the scientific anomalies do not exist. The honest position holds all of these perspectives in tension, acknowledges what each of them brings to the question, and refrains from the premature resolution that would require ignoring part of the evidence. What the Shroud of Turin shows is a series of properties that are consistent with it being a first-century burial cloth and inconsistent with it being a medieval forgery using any known technique. What it also shows is a radiocarbon date from 3 concordant laboratory results that places the sampled linen in the medieval period. The relationship between these two sets of evidence depends on the validity of the 1988 sampling, which is itself a contested scientific question. Beyond the physical evidence, the shroud carries the weight of what it has meant to the people who have venerated it and the people who have studied it, the weight of being an object that has been at the center of one of the most intense and most sustained scientific historical controversies of the modern period. Its significance is not reducible to either its physical properties or its religious meaning. It is an object that holds both, that refuses to be only one thing or the other, that insists, by the specific character of its anomalies, on being taken seriously in both dimensions simultaneously. The cloth is 14 feet long and 3.5 feet wide. It is old. It bears an image that science has not explained. It has a history that is documented from the 1350s and claimed to extend much further. It has been examined by more scientists, with more instruments than any other single object in human history. And after all of that examination, after all of those instruments and all of those arguments and all of those papers, the question of what it is and how it came to be what it is remains, as it has always been, open. The person looking at the Shroud of Turin, whether in the cathedral in Turin, or in a photograph, or in a documentary, is looking at an object that has not yielded a definitive answer to the most basic questions. What is it? Who made it? And how? What the evidence shows is what has been described in this account. What the evidence cannot show is the conclusion. That belongs to the person looking. The cloth waits in its case in Turin. It has been waiting for a very long time. The specific moment of Secondo Pia's discovery in 1898 deserves more attention than it typically receives in accounts of the shroud, because the nature of what he found and the specific significance of his discovery for the subsequent history of shroud research is not simply the finding of a visual curiosity. It is the discovery of a property of the image that fundamentally changes the question being asked about how it was made. Before Pia's photographs, the debate about the shroud was essentially a religious and historical debate. Was this cloth authentic or not? Was it the burial cloth of Christ, or was it a medieval fabrication? These questions were debated on the basis of historical documents, theological arguments, and general artistic analysis. After Pia's photographs, the debate added a scientific dimension that was independent of faith or theology. However the image was made, it has a specific photographic property that requires explanation. The image is a negative, and this property demands an account of how it came to be so. The specific discomfort that the negative character of the image produces for any medieval forgery hypothesis is worth spelling out precisely. If a medieval artist created the shroud image, the artist created a negative image, an image in which the tonal values are the reverse of what we see in normal observation. The darker areas of the image represent the lighter areas of the face. The lighter areas represent the shadows. To create such an image deliberately, the artist would have needed not only to decide to create a negative image, but to understand what a negative image would look like when reversed. They would have been working toward an endpoint that they could not directly see, creating an image that looked wrong to them in order to produce something that would look right when seen in a way that would not be possible for 500 years. This is not impossible. It is simply very strange as a strategy for producing a fraudulent relic. A fraudulent relic is intended to convince the people who see it that it is genuine. A medieval viewer of the shroud, looking at the actual cloth, would see a faint, slightly strange image that suggested a human figure, but whose tonal values were inverted relative to normal vision. Why would a forger create an image that did not look its best in the conditions under which it would actually be seen, in favor of an image that would look much better when processed by a technology that would not be invented for half a millennium? The strategic logic of creating a photographic negative in the 14th century as a fraudulent relic to be displayed to 14th century viewers is not obvious. The most straightforward explanation for the negative character of the image is that the image was not created by a direct artistic process, where the artist sees the result as they work, but by some other process, in which the image was formed on the cloth in a way that did not allow the maker to see the full result directly. A contact process, in which the image-forming effect was transmitted from a three-dimensional surface to the cloth, might produce a negative image if the image-forming effect was greater where the surface was closer to the cloth and diminished as the distance increased. The imaging of a body on a cloth draped over it would be exactly this kind of contact process. The Stirp analysis of the image formation mechanism is the most technically detailed examination of how the image might have been formed, and its conclusions are correspondingly specific. The coloring of the image fibers is chemical in nature. The fibers are oxidized and dehydrated, the cellulose of the flax fibers having undergone a chemical change that made them darker than the surrounding uncolored fibers. This is the same process that makes linen yellow with age, but concentrated in a specific pattern at the very surface of the cloth. The depth of the image coloring, less than 200 nanometers, is the property that is most difficult to account for in any known image formation process. 200 nanometers is roughly 2/10,000ths of a millimeter, or about 1/10 of the width of a human hair. The image coloring does not penetrate even the full diameter of a single linen fiber. It is confined to the outermost surface layer of the outermost surface fibers. This means that any process that created the image did so in a way that affected only the surface of the cloth, without allowing any coloring agent or energy to penetrate to the fibers immediately below. Consider the implications of this for any hypothetical image formation process. A liquid pigment applied to the surface of the cloth would be drawn into the cloth by capillary action, spreading through the thread structure rather than remaining exclusively on the surface fibers. A vapor depositing a chemical compound on the cloth surface might be more consistent with the shallow penetration, but it would need to be a vapor of precisely the right composition to oxidize and dehydrate only cellulose, without leaving any residue of the depositing compound. A radiation process, whether light or other electromagnetic radiation, might cause the required chemical change at the surface without penetrating deeply, but the specific nature of the radiation and the mechanism of the chemical change would need to be specified. No proposed mechanism for the image formation has been accepted as explaining all the observed properties simultaneously. Proposals based on heat, contact with a heated bas-relief, fail to explain the shallow penetration because heat from a hot surface would conduct through the thread structure and affect fibers at depth as well as at the surface. Proposals based on radiation fail to explain the specific chemical change observed without specifying a radiation source that no medieval environment would have contained. Proposals based on chemical vapor, such as amines produced by a decomposing body, face difficulties with the specificity and the resolution of the image, which is finer than diffusion of vapor molecules would typically allow. The image resolution problem is related to the depth problem. The shroud image, when examined closely, shows detail that is consistent with the scale of individual threads, rather than with a process that would naturally blur at the scale of the thread diameter. A vapor process, for example, would be expected to show diffusion effects at the scale of the gap between the cloth and the body surface, blurring the edges of features by the amount that vapor molecules spread out as they diffuse through air. The shroud image does not show this kind of diffusion blurring to the extent that would be expected from a simple vapor contact process. The specific combination of shallow penetration, high resolution, negative tonal character, three-dimensional information content, and chemical composition without identifiable residue of a causative agent is what makes the shroud image scientifically unique. Each of these properties, taken alone, might be accountable by some process. All of them together, in the same object, have not been accounted for by any single known process. The 3D information property, discovered by Jackson and Jumper in 1976 and subsequently confirmed by multiple other researchers using digital image processing, is perhaps the most striking of these properties because it has an objective, instrumental character that is not subject to interpretation in the way that some of the other properties are. When you run the shroud image through a program that maps brightness to elevation, you get a coherent three-dimensional figure. When you run a photograph of a painting through the same program, you get a distorted mess. This is not a matter of opinion or of interpretation. It is a measurable property that distinguishes the shroud image from painted images. And it is a property that is consistent with the image having been formed by a process in which the image intensity varied with the distance between the cloth and the surface it was imaging. The Jackson-Jumper finding in 1976 was the catalyst for the formation of the STURP team and the 1978 examination. Jackson was at the time a physicist at Sandia Laboratories, later at the Air Force Weapons Laboratory, and was sufficiently impressed by the VP8 analysis to commit to a major scientific examination of the cloth. He has remained one of the leading researchers on the shroud for the subsequent 4 decades, and has continued to develop the hypothesis that the image was formed by a radiation process associated with the resurrection event, a hypothesis that is explicitly theological rather than purely scientific, and that lies outside the testable domain of science. It is worth being explicit about this. The authentication hypothesis, as held by its most committed scientific proponents, typically involves at some point a step outside science, into the domain of religious belief. The authentic evidence can establish that the shroud has anomalous properties that are inconsistent with a medieval forgery. It cannot establish from within science the theological conclusion that those anomalous properties are the result of a specific miraculous event. The gap between the scientific finding and the theological conclusion is a gap that must be crossed by faith, not by evidence. This does not invalidate the scientific evidence. Anomalous properties are anomalous regardless of their ultimate cause, and the failure to account for them by any known physical or chemical mechanism is a scientific fact, regardless of whether one believes the cause is miraculous or merely unknown. The honest atheist who examines the shroud evidence must acknowledge that the image has properties that science cannot currently explain, even if they decline to attribute those properties to a miraculous cause. The honest believer must acknowledge that the scientific evidence, however suggestive, does not prove the theological claim, even if they believe the theological claim on other grounds. The cultural history of the shroud, its role in the religious life of the communities that have venerated it, is also part of the object's significance and deserves acknowledgement. For millions of Christians across 6 centuries of documented history, and for many times more in the tradition that may extend further back, the shroud has been a focal point for devotion, a direct material connection to the events that are central to their faith, a physical witness to a suffering and a death that their tradition holds to be cosmically significant. Whatever the shroud actually is, the meaning it has carried for those who have venerated it is not negated by any scientific finding. Even if the cloth were definitively proven to be a medieval fabrication, the centuries of devotion it has received would remain a historical fact about human religious life. Similarly, the history of scientific investigation of the shroud, the long series of examinations and analyses and papers and arguments, is itself significant as an episode in the history of the relationship between science and religion, between empirical investigation and faith traditions. The shroud has been subjected to more scientific scrutiny than any comparable religious object, and the result of that scrutiny has not been what either the most fervent believers or the most confident skeptics expected. It has produced not resolution, but complication, not certainty, but an increasingly detailed understanding of how much remains uncertain. The social dynamics of the shroud debate have not always been edifying. Both sides of the argument have at times been characterized by motivated reasoning, by the selective emphasis of evidence that supports a predetermined conclusion and the dismissal of evidence that challenges it. The scientific community's reaction to the 1988 dating was, in some quarters, an overconfidence that was not warranted by the complexity of the evidence. The response of some authentication advocates to the Rogers findings has been an overconfidence in the opposite direction, treating the repair patch hypothesis as established when it remains contested. Both of these departures from appropriate epistemic humility have not served the investigation well. The most productive relationship to the shroud evidence is one of genuine openness to what the evidence shows, including the parts that are inconvenient for any predetermined conclusion. The evidence for a first-century origin is real and specific and scientifically documented. The evidence from the 1988 dating is also real and specific and scientifically documented. The question of how to weigh these two bodies of evidence against each other, given the doubt cast by Rogers on the sampling validity of the 1988 dating, is a genuine scientific question that has not been resolved by the evidence available. The most straightforward way to address this question would be additional radiocarbon testing, this time from samples drawn from multiple locations across the main body of the shroud, far from the corner area that was sampled in 1988. Such testing would either confirm the medieval date across multiple sampling locations, which would strongly undermine the repair patch hypothesis, or produce different dates from different parts of the cloth, which would strongly support it. The Vatican has not approved such testing for reasons that are not entirely clear, and the question remains open in the absence of the additional data that would clarify it. The technical difficulty of such testing has diminished dramatically since 1988. Accelerator mass spectrometry dating now requires far smaller samples than the techniques of 1988 required, and the analysis can be performed on samples too small to be visible to the naked eye. The potential damage to the shroud from additional sampling is correspondingly smaller. The scientific argument for a new round of testing, using the methodological improvements of the past 3 decades and addressing the sampling concerns raised by Rogers, is strong. Whether such testing will be approved and conducted remains to be seen. Until it is, the position of the evidence is what has been described. The image is scientifically anomalous. The blood chemistry is consistent with real blood from a traumatically injured person. The pollen distribution is consistent with a Near Eastern origin. The 3D information is consistent with a contact process rather than a painting process. The vanillin evidence raises questions about the sampling validity of the 1988 dating, and the cloth itself waits in Turin, in its case, with whatever answers it contains still inside it. The moment that Secondo Pia, alone in his darkroom in 1898, first saw the image emerge from the developing solution and realized what he was looking at, was the moment that the shroud became not merely a religious object, but a scientific puzzle. He had been given permission to photograph a piece of linen. He found himself holding the first evidence that the linen contained something that no one had been looking for, and no one could immediately explain. The shock he described, the near dropping of the plate, is understandable. It has been more than 125 years since that moment in the darkroom. The puzzle that Pia discovered has been worked on by some of the best scientific minds of the 20th and 21st centuries, using the most advanced analytical techniques available. It has not been solved. The image is still there, still bearing its properties, still failing to yield to any proposed explanation. The cloth is still in Turin. What it is, and how it came to be what it is, remains the question. The evidence presented here is the evidence. The conclusion is yours. The scientific community's engagement with the shroud has not been uniformly enthusiastic, and the reasons for the reluctance of mainstream science to treat the shroud as a serious object of inquiry deserve examination. Science, as a social institution, has norms about what constitutes a respectable research problem, and objects associated with religious faith are often regarded with a suspicion that can interfere with rigorous examination. The shroud suffers from a dual association. It is associated with Christian devotion, which makes secular scientists reluctant to appear to validate religious claims, and it has attracted significant interest from people whose arguments mix genuine scientific observation with explicit theological commitment, which makes it easier for skeptics to dismiss the entire body of evidence by association with its less rigorously argued proponents. The STURP team encountered this dynamic directly. The team included scientists from prestigious institutions, using genuine scientific instruments and genuine scientific methodology, and their findings were published in peer-reviewed journals. But the popular association of the shroud with religious belief meant that their work was more often received in the context of religious controversy than in the context of scientific inquiry, and the institutional pressures of a scientific career did not encourage sustained engagement with an object that carried this kind of baggage. Dre Rogers, whose 2005 paper is the most rigorous scientific challenge to the 1988 dating, was a chemist of genuine distinction whose work at Los Alamos on energetic materials and other problems was recognized by his peers throughout his career. His engagement with the shroud was conducted with the same rigor he brought to other problems, and his Thermochimica Acta paper was peer-reviewed and published in a respectable journal. But the association of his conclusions with the religious authentication argument has made it easier for skeptics to dismiss his work than the scientific content of the work would warrant. The sociology of the shroud debate, the ways in which the institutional dynamics of science and the cultural dynamics of religious controversy have shaped how the evidence has been received and evaluated, is itself a topic of legitimate scholarly interest. Historians and sociologists of science have noted that the shroud represents an unusual case in which the evidence genuinely does not resolve cleanly in one direction, and in which the social and institutional factors shaping interpretation are unusually powerful because of the religious significance of the question. This is not unique to the shroud. Controversial scientific questions of all kinds are subject to these dynamics. But the religious dimension makes the shroud case particularly acute. The specific history of the 1988 dating is instructive in this regard. The testing was presented publicly as a definitive resolution, a scientific answer to a question that had been debated for centuries. This framing reflected both the confidence of the scientists involved in the reliability of radiocarbon dating and the desire of the Vatican and the scientific community to put the question to rest. When Rogers subsequently questioned the sampling, his challenge was not given the public attention that the original results had received, partly because the original results had already been widely accepted, and partly because the institutional interest in a definitive answer had been invested in those results. This is not a conspiracy. It is the ordinary dynamic of scientific discourse, in which extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence to overturn established results. Rogers's evidence was substantial, but it was not overwhelming in the sense of being impossible to contest, and the contest has continued in the literature without producing the kind of clear resolution that would force a change in the scientific consensus. The consensus on the 1988 dating remains, in the mainstream scientific community, that the results are probably reliable. The challenge to that consensus, represented by Rogers and by subsequent researchers who have found additional evidence consistent with the repair patch hypothesis, remains a minority position. Whether the minority position is correct is precisely the question that additional testing would resolve. The absence of such testing is the most significant ongoing limitation in the scientific investigation of the Shroud, and its absence is a product of institutional decisions by the Vatican rather than of scientific limitations. The tools for a definitive test exist. The will to conduct the test has not, so far, been exercised. The image formation question, separate from the dating question, remains perhaps the deepest scientific puzzle the Shroud presents. The inability to replicate the image after decades of trying is not simply a matter of not having tried hard enough. It is a matter of the image having properties that are, individually and collectively, inconsistent with any known image formation process. When a scientist says that an observation is inconsistent with any known process, this means one of three things. The observation is wrong, unlikely, given its independent confirmation by multiple researchers. A known process is being applied in an unknown way that produces these properties, possible but requires specification of the process and mechanism. Or the observation is correct, and the process responsible for it is genuinely unknown. The third option is the most uncomfortable for science, because it implies a gap in scientific knowledge rather than a gap in scientific application. Gaps in scientific knowledge are not unusual. Science is a process of identifying and filling such gaps, and the history of science is the history of anomalies that were explained only when new concepts were developed. The Shroud image anomaly may eventually be explained by a process or mechanism that is not currently understood. The history of science suggests that it would be premature to conclude that because no known process explains the image is therefore miraculous. Many phenomena that seemed inexplicable by the science of one period were explained by the science of a subsequent period. But premature dismissal of anomalies is also antithetical to scientific progress. Anomalies that are ignored rather than investigated do not contribute to the development of science. The Shroud image anomaly has been investigated seriously, and the investigation has not produced an explanation. The appropriate scientific response to a sustained failure to explain a genuine anomaly is continued investigation, not dismissal and not premature conclusion. The blood stains on the Shroud have been subjected to molecular biological analysis, as well as the chemical analysis already described. The blood has been characterized as type AB in some analyses, a blood type that is relatively rare in the general population, but found at higher rates in populations of Middle Eastern origin. The blood type result has been contested, partly because ancient blood samples are difficult to type reliably, and partly because the apparent blood type may reflect degradation of the blood rather than its original type. The AB blood type finding is consistent with but not strongly supportive of a Middle Eastern origin for the individual in the cloth. DNA analysis of the blood and other biological material on the shroud has been attempted, with results that are complex and contested. A 250 study found DNA from numerous plant species and from human individuals from diverse geographic origins, interpreted by the authors as consistent with the cloth having been handled by many people from many places over a long period. This finding is more consistent with the documented history of the shroud as an object of widespread veneration than with anything more specific about its origin. Ancient DNA analysis of biological material that has been handled by many people over many centuries faces fundamental challenges of contamination and degradation that make specific conclusions about the original biology of the cloth extremely difficult. The fate of the cloth, after any potential original first-century use, is a subject for which the historical record provides little guidance. The authentication hypothesis requires the shroud to have been preserved for approximately 13 centuries, from the 1st century to its documented appearance in France in the 1350s, without leaving any clear documentary or archaeological trace of its existence. Without leaving period for a perishable material, even linen, and the documentation gap is one of the strongest historical arguments against a first-century origin. Proponents of the authentication hypothesis have proposed various routes for the cloth's preservation and transmission, including the image of Edessa identification already mentioned, the Mandylion hypothesis, in which the cloth was known but folded so that only the face was visible, and various hypotheses about preservation in Constantinople until the Fourth Crusade. These hypotheses fill the documentary gap with plausible stories, but they remain speculative, unsupported by definitive documentary evidence. The absence of documentation is not proof of absence, particularly for a cloth that might have been deliberately kept hidden for security or theological reasons, but it is an evidentiary gap that the historical case for authenticity has not definitively filled. The Mandylion hypothesis, in particular, has attracted significant scholarly attention. The Mandylion, or image of Edessa, was a cloth bearing an image of Christ that was kept at Edessa, the modern Turkish city of Şanlıurfa, from some point in the early centuries of the Common Era until 944 AD, when it was transferred to Constantinople. The Constantinople records describe the Mandylion as a cloth with a face image only, which would be consistent with the shroud being kept folded with only the face visible. The tetradiplon, or doubled in four, described in some Byzantine sources. The Mandylion disappeared from Constantinople records during or after the Fourth Crusade of 1204, after which various relics were taken to various European locations. The identification of the shroud with the Mandylion is possible but not established. The description of the Mandylion as showing only a face, not a full body, is either consistent with a folded shroud or inconsistent with a full-length burial cloth. The iconographic parallels between Byzantine images of the Mandylion face and the face visible in the shroud have been noted by art historians, who find similarities in the specific features: the asymmetrical beard, the prominent nose, the long hair. Whether these parallels reflect a common origin or a later artistic tradition influenced by the shroud image or its copies is a question that art history alone cannot resolve. The carbon dating, the image anomalies, the blood chemistry, the pollen, the weave, the historical documentation, each of these lines of evidence is internally complex, subject to varying interpretation, and pointing in more than one direction when the full range of possible interpretations is considered. The shroud is not a simple case in which all the evidence points one way and a single contrary finding is the obstacle to consensus. It is a case in which the evidence genuinely points in multiple directions and where the difficulty of resolution is not a failure of investigation, but a reflection of the genuine complexity of the object. What is certain is that the cloth exists, 14 feet of linen, in Turin, in a case bearing an image that has not been explained. What is certain is that the image has been scientifically documented to have properties that are inconsistent with any known image formation process. What is certain is that the 1988 dating produced a result, and that result has been scientifically questioned in a publication that passed peer review. What is certain is that the question is open. The viewer who has followed this account of the evidence, who has attended to the carbon dating and the vanillin chemistry and the VP8 analysis and the pollen data and the blood chemistry and the weave, is now in possession of the relevant facts. These are the facts that are available. They are incomplete, because no complete account of the shroud is possible from the evidence currently available. They are contested, because every significant finding has been questioned by someone with the standing to question it. And they are unresolved, because no available synthesis of the evidence produces a conclusion that is both consistent with all the data and acceptable to all the relevant scientific communities. The cloth is in Turin. The image is on the cloth. The questions are in the evidence. And the conclusion is not in any documentary or instrument or analysis that currently exists. It is where it has always been, waiting with the patience of a piece of linen that has been waiting for a long time and shows no sign of yielding to the demand for certainty that the people who examine it bring to it. The evidence is presented. What to make of it is, and has always been, a question for the person looking. The question of why the shroud produces such strong reactions in people who encounter it, on both sides of the authentication debate, is itself worth examining. The skeptics who approach the shroud sometimes display a hostility and a certainty that goes beyond what the evidence warrants for its dismissal, just as believers sometimes display a certainty that goes beyond what the evidence warrants for its authentication. The strength of these reactions suggests that the shroud touches something deeper than the specific question of whether a piece of linen is 2,000 years old. For the believer, the shroud is not merely an archaeological question. It is a question about the most fundamental claims of their faith, about whether the central event they believe to be the most significant in human history left a physical mark on the material world. The stakes of the question are as high as they could be for a person of faith. A confirmed, authentic shroud would be, in some sense, a physical witness to the resurrection, a material object that had been present at the moment they believe to have been the turning point of human history. A confirmed forgery would be a demonstration that the most venerated relic of Christianity is a fraud. For the committed skeptic, the shroud is a test case for the epistemological standards of modernity, a question about whether faith can override evidence and whether the scientific community is willing to pursue evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads toward uncomfortable territory. The image anomalies, in particular, present a challenge that science has not resolved, and the failure to resolve them is uncomfortable in a way that goes beyond the specific scientific question. If science cannot explain the shroud image, what does that failure imply? The skeptic who is committed to the view that all phenomena are in principle scientifically explicable finds the shroud's persistent anomalies an unwelcome challenge. Both of these reactions are understandable, but neither is epistemically appropriate. The shroud is an object. It has properties. Those properties are what they are, regardless of what any particular person wants them to be. The appropriate relationship to the evidence is neither the credulity that accepts any argument for authenticity because authenticity would confirm the faith, nor the hostility that dismisses any challenge to the dating because the dating confirmed the skeptical view. It is the patient, honest, uncomfortable engagement with what the evidence actually shows. The scientific investigation of the Shroud has modeled this patient engagement in its best moments and departed from it in its worst. The STURP team, whatever their individual religious beliefs, approached the cloth with instruments and recorded what the instruments showed, published their findings in peer-reviewed journals, and reached a collective conclusion that was honest about both what they had found and what they had not found. Ray Rogers approached the vanilline question as a skeptic trying to refute an argument and changed his position when the evidence he gathered pointed in the opposite direction. The worst moments have been the overconfident announcements of resolution from both directions. The three-liker dating was presented as settling the question, when the question of whether the correct part of the cloth had been sampled was a legitimate one that the presentation did not address. Subsequent enthusiasts for the authentication argument have sometimes presented Rogers' findings as definitively overturning the 1988 dating, when those findings, however significant, do not by themselves demonstrate that the main cloth is 1st century rather than medieval. The honest middle position, the one that the evidence supports, is that the question remains open, and that what is needed is not more interpretation of existing evidence, but additional evidence. The additional evidence most directly relevant to resolving the dating question is additional radiocarbon testing from the main body of the cloth, the kind of testing that has not yet been approved. The additional evidence most relevant to resolving the image formation question is a replication experiment that successfully produces an image with all of the known shroud image properties simultaneously, or a demonstration that no such replication is possible with any known process. Neither of these additional evidence types is currently available. In their absence, the existing evidence is the evidence, and it does not resolve the question. The cathedral in Turin is a large Baroque structure rebuilt after a fire in 1997 that damaged the chapel where the shroud was then kept. The shroud survived the 1997 fire as it has survived the other fires and displacements of its history. It was moved to safety by firefighters who broke through a glass case with a sledgehammer to extract it from the flames, and it sustained no significant new damage. The irony that the shroud has now survived 2 significant fires, one in 1532 and one in 1997, while the buildings around it burned, is noted by those who see the cloth's survival as significant and dismissed by those who see it as coincidence. The cloth is now kept in a bulletproof and fireproof case, in a climate-controlled environment, in a chapel adjacent to the main cathedral. It is displayed publicly on rare occasions, and the most recent public exhibitions have attracted millions of visitors over their duration. Those visitors stand before the case and look at the cloth and experience whatever they experience, which is different for different people, and which the cloth itself, indifferent and persistent, does not attempt to prescribe. The image on the cloth is approximately what a person who died in the manner described by the Gospels would have produced if they were wrapped in a linen cloth after death. The image is consistent with this, and also with other explanations. The blood is consistent with real blood from a traumatically injured person, and also with careful medieval imitation. The pollen is consistent with a cloth that spent time in Jerusalem, and also with contamination or error. The vanillin evidence is consistent with a cloth much older than the 1988 dating suggests, and also with the effects of the 1532 fire on the kinetics of vanillin degradation. Every element of the evidence is consistent with more than one interpretation. This is the nature of the evidence. It is not a failure of the investigators or the instruments or the methods. It is the character of the object under examination, which presents a set of properties that, taken together, do not resolve unambiguously into one answer. This is genuinely unusual. Most archaeological questions, including most questions about ancient textiles, can be resolved to a degree of confidence that is satisfying, if not absolute. The shroud resists this resolution. Its properties are such that the authentication argument cannot be definitively refuted by the available evidence, and the forgery argument cannot be definitively refuted either. It occupies a zone of genuine evidential ambiguity that is rare in the study of historical objects. Whether this ambiguity will eventually be resolved by additional evidence is uncertain. Additional radiocarbon testing, if approved and conducted, would either confirm the medieval date across multiple sampling locations or reveal the dating heterogeneity predicted by the repair patch hypothesis. Either result would significantly change the evidentiary situation. A successful replication of the image formation would similarly change the situation by demonstrating that a known mechanism can account for the observed properties. The absence of a successful replication after decades of trying does not prove that the mechanism is unknowable, but it increases the evidentiary weight of the anomaly. The Shroud of Turin will remain in Turin, in its case, available for examination by those with the authority to examine it, and visible to those who come to see it. The question of what it is will remain with us until the evidence that would resolve it is either obtained or demonstrated to be unobtainable. The questions are real, the evidence is real, the uncertainty is real, and the cloth, 14 feet of linen bearing an image that science has not explained, waits with the patience of something that has been waiting for a very long time and expects to wait longer.